Imagine a throat, a narrow, jagged passage of water, only 21 miles wide at its tightest point. This is the Strait of Hormuz. Through this single, pulsing artery flows 20% of the world's liquid energy. If this artery clogs, the global economy doesn't just slow down, it suffers a stroke. When you look at the headlines coming out of this region, the flash of missiles over Damascus, the shadow of a drone over a tanker, the heated rhetoric from Washington and Tehran, it feels like chaos. It feels like an ancient, emotional clash of civilizations that has finally boiled over. But in the lab, we see something else entirely. We see a mathematical standoff. Underneath the smoke and the fury lies an invisible board. Every move made by a general, every tweet sent by a diplomat, and every tactical strike in a desert outpost is a move on a massive, interconnected grid of logic. This isn't a story of madness. It is a story of cold, calculated strategy. By the end of this video, you aren't going to look at the news and see senseless violence. You are going to see a high-stakes simulation running in real time. You are going to see the board behind the headlines. And once you see the geometry of this conflict, you can never unsee it. Welcome to the lab. Let's look at the players. To understand any game, you have to know who is sitting at the table, and, more importantly, what they are actually playing for. In game theory, we call this utility. It is the internal scorecard that determines if a move is a victory or a defeat. First, we have the triad: the United States, Israel, and Iran. On the surface, they all say they want stability, but their hidden utilities tell a different story. For the United States, the payoff is the global flow, keeping the energy lanes open and the cost of a gallon of gas low. For Israel, the payoff is existential security, the non-negotiable requirement that no rival in the region acquires a weapon that could end their story in a single afternoon. For Iran, the payoff is deterrence and depth, building a ring of influence so wide that no one would dare strike the heart of the regime. But here is where the geometry gets messy. On a standard board, players move their own pieces. But in this game, we have to account for the proxy variable. Think of Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Houthis in Yemen as independent variables. In the math of war, these are agents. While they are funded by the principal, Iran, they are not remote-controlled drones. They have their own internal scorecards. They have their own local payoffs. This creates a dangerous tilt on the board. An agent might decide that a zero-sum strike on a ship is in their best interest, even if it ruins the principal's non-zero-sum negotiation with a superpower. When the pieces on the board start moving themselves, the rational actor model begins to smoke. You aren't just playing against an opponent. You are playing against a chaotic feedback loop, where one small move in a narrow strait can trigger a calculation that no one at the main table intended to make. To find the truth of how this ends, we have to look at the trap that keeps them all locked in place. We have to look at the prisoner's dilemma. Why peace is irrationally hard. If you sit a room full of people down and ask them, is a $100 billion war a good idea? Every single one of them will say no. It is a shared catastrophe. So, why is peace so hard to engineer? Why does the world seem to default to the most expensive, most dangerous option? To understand this, we have to look at the mathematical cage known as the prisoner's dilemma. Imagine a simple matrix. On the vertical axis, we have Israel. On the horizontal, Iran. They each have two choices: de-escalate or rearm. If both sides choose to de-escalate, they win the ultimate payoff. Billions of dollars move from missile defense to medicine. The soup pot of the region grows. This is the global optimum. But here is the sinister logic of the trap. The game isn't played in a vacuum of transparency. It is played in a fog of information asymmetry. You don't know what the player across the board is doing. You only know what they might do. If Israel de-escalates but Iran secretly rearms, Israel faces an existential threat. If Iran de-escalates but Israel strikes, the Iranian regime collapses. From the perspective of pure, cold-blooded survival, rearm is what we call a dominant strategy. It doesn't matter what the other person does. You are technically safer if you arm yourself. When both players follow this perfectly rational logic to protect themselves, they both end up in the bottom right corner of the matrix, a cycle of endless military spending and hair-trigger tension. They aren't there because they are warmongers. They are there because the math of self-interest, combined with a total lack of trust, makes peace look like a suicide mission. This brings us to a concept that explains why the last 40 years have looked like a shadow war rather than a total explosion. We call it the Nash Equilibrium. It is the skeletal structure of the conflict, the point where the board freezes because no one can move without making their situation worse. For decades, we've seen a relentless rhythm of sabotage, cyber attacks, and targeted strikes. To a casual observer, this looks like a prelude to war. But in the lab, we see a stable rut. Think of it as a mathematical deadlock. If Iran were to stop its shadow operations, it would lose its only leverage against a superior conventional military force. If Israel were to stop its tactical interventions, it would allow a nuclear or conventional buildup that it cannot survive. Neither side can unilaterally quit the shadow war without giving the other a massive terminal advantage. But, conversely, neither side can go to full war. A total conflict would be so destructive, zero-sum in the worst sense, that it would wipe out the very payoffs they are fighting for. So, they settle. They settle into the shadow war as a Nash equilibrium. It is a miserable, expensive, and tense resting point, but it is stable. It is a point of no return, where both players are making the best move they can, given that the other player is also standing there with a knife to their throat. The tragedy of the Middle East isn't that it's chaotic. The tragedy is that it is perfectly balanced in a rut of mutual hostility. The players haven't stopped fighting because they found peace. They've stopped because the math has boxed them in. But as we're about to see, this equilibrium is currently being pushed to the breaking point. When the abstract math of the boardroom meets the salt spray of the Persian Gulf, the game changes. It becomes visceral. It becomes a game of hawk-dove, more commonly known as chicken. Picture two high-speed vessels, a massive U.S. destroyer and a fast attack craft from the IRGC, streaking toward each other in a narrow shipping lane. In this geometry, there are only two roles: the hawk who stays the course and the dove who swerves. If both play the dove and swerve, they maintain a peaceful, albeit tense, status quo. But if one plays the hawk and the other swerves, the hawk wins a massive prize: reputational dominance. Here is where the math gets savage. For a superpower, the payoff isn't just about the physical ship, it's about the credibility of its global mantle. If a global titan swerves to a regional power, the mathematical loss of prestige is often calculated as greater than the cost of a physical collision. This is the dignity variable. When you add the weight of a nation's pride to the spreadsheet, the rational move suddenly shifts from avoiding a crash to inviting one. The danger of chicken is that it relies on the other player being sane enough to blink. But in the Strait of Hormuz, both players are incentivized to throw their steering wheels out the window to prove they can't swerve. It is a race to the edge of the map, where the only thing keeping the world from a collision is the hope that someone, somewhere, still values survival over a perfect reputation. Zero-sum versus non-zero-sum, the energy trap. To truly master the board, you have to understand the two different universes the players are moving through simultaneously. First, there is the battlefield universe. This is strictly zero-sum. If a missile hits a base, one side gains a tactical advantage and the other loses it. The sum of the gain and the loss is zero. It is a game of pure friction and theft. This is the logic of the shadow war, moving a line on a map or destroying a centrifuges. But surrounding this battlefield is the global universe, which is non-zero-sum. This is our soup pot. The global energy market is a collaborative engine. When it runs smoothly, the pie expands. China gets the fuel to manufacture, the West gets the goods to consume, and Iran gets the capital to survive. This creates the energy trap. A total war in the Strait is a zero-sum move that destroys the non-zero-sum engine. If Iran blocks the flow of oil, they aren't just hurting their enemies, they are poisoning the soup for their own allies, like China. The strategic brilliance and the extreme risk of Iran's position lies in this tension. They use the threat of a zero-sum collapse, closing the Strait, to gain non-zero-sum leverage. They are essentially holding a grenade in a crowded kitchen, betting that the other players value the soup so much that they will grant Iran concessions just to keep the pin in place. It is a high-wire act where one slip turns a profitable negotiation into a global famine. The question for the lab is, how much longer can the world play along before the human glitch takes over? If we were all cold, calculating machines, the board would be easy to read. But as any diplomat in a war room will tell you, the rational actor model has a massive built-in human glitch. To see this glitch in the wild, we use the ultimatum game. Imagine I'm given $100. The rules are simple. I have to offer you a portion. If you accept, we both keep the money. If you reject it, the money vanishes and we both get zero. Pure mathematical logic says that if I offer you one single dollar, you should take it. One is better than zero. But that isn't what happens. Across every culture, people reject low offers. They would rather lose and get zero than see someone else get an unfair 99. In the lab, we call this spite. When we apply this to the Middle East, we see the red lines. If Israel or Iran feels an attack was unfair, or, more importantly, humiliating, they will retaliate even if the math says it will cost them billions. This isn't just an emotional outburst. It is a biological drive to punish unfairness. Here is the savage reality. In the long term, spite is actually a deterrent strategy. If you are always rational, you are predictable. If you are predictable, you can be exploited. To survive on the invisible board, you must be willing to burn the board to the ground once in a while. You have to prove that you aren't a dove that can be bullied into a $1 offer. You have to show that your dignity has a price tag that the other player simply cannot afford. This leads us to one of the most effective and terrifying tactics in the history of the game, the Madman Theory. Usually, the goal in a game is to convince the other player that you are smart, stable, and rational. But sometimes, the only way to win is to convince them that you are defiantly irrational. If I am playing chicken with you in the Strait, and I visibly rip the steering wheel out of my dashboard and throw it out the window, I have just won the game. Why? Because I have signaled to you that I cannot swerve even if I wanted to. The burden of avoiding the collision is now entirely on you. When you hear the aggressive, sometimes apocalyptic rhetoric used by leaders in this conflict, you have to ask a fundamental question. Is this noise, or is it a signal? Are they actually crazy, or are they mathematically simulating craziness? By acting mad, a leader forces their opponent to swerve in every negotiation. They are creating a strategic uncertainty. If the USA or Israel isn't 100% sure that Iran will act rationally, they have to move with extreme caution. In the lab, we call this the logic of the illogical. It is a high-stakes performance where the madman uses his perceived instability as a shield. But the danger of the madman theory is the signal flare effect. Eventually, you might convince your opponent so thoroughly that you're crazy that they decide the only rational move left is to take you off the board entirely. The line between a genius strategy and a fatal error is thinner than a razor's edge. In the lab, we move from the snapshot to the cinema. Most people look at a single explosion and see a beginning or an end. But this isn't a one-round game. This is an iterated game, a sequence of moves that has been played back and forth for over 40 years. In an iterated world, the math changes. A strategy that works once, like a sudden, unprovoked betrayal, might fail miserably when you have to face that same player tomorrow next year, and a decade from now. Evolution has taught us that in these long-term ruts, the most successful strategy isn't the most ruthless one. It's a strategy called tit-for-tat. To be successful, a strategy must be three things: nice, retaliatory, and forgiving. You start by cooperating, or at least not escalating. If you are hit, you retaliate immediately to maintain deterrence. But, and this is the key, you must be willing to be forgiving. If the other player stops hitting, you stop hitting. Look at the exchange of strikes we see in the headlines. A drone strike here, a retaliatory missile there, followed by a sudden quiet lull. To the outside world, it looks like a failing war. In the lab, we see a nice, retaliatory, and forgiving sequence. It is a disciplined language of force designed to maintain the equilibrium without triggering a total collapse. The players are using the math of tit-for-tat to signal their red lines without burning the entire board. They are builders of a very dark kind of order, using the calculus of change to ensure that even in a state of war, the game continues. We have traveled a long way in this experiment. We've moved from the spoonful of soup and the ghost in the machine to the high-stakes, invisible board of the Strait of Hormuz. We've seen how the prisoner's dilemma traps us, how the Nash Equilibrium freezes us, and how the human glitch of spite can tilt the world toward chaos. But the point of the lab isn't just to watch the world burn or to admire the complexity of the fire. The point is to engineer a better map. The only way to win a deadly game is to change the rules. When you understand the math of the board, you stop being a victim of the headlines. You stop seeing chaos and start seeing the underlying structure. Logic is the only lens that can pierce the fog of war. Whether you are a student, a developer at Ignex, or just a citizen of this planet, your superpower is the ability to look at a high-tech hallucination and ask, what is the utility? Where is the equilibrium? We are building the tools to automate this truth-finding process, to strip away the noise so we can see the world as it actually is, not just how we are told to fear it. The board is always shifting. The lines of force are always moving. But as long as we have the math, we have a way home. In our next lab experiment, we're going to step away from the battlefield of nations and look at the battlefield of the mind. We're diving into the high-stakes world of AI and the economics of attention. We'll see how the same logic that runs a naval blockade is currently being used to capture your focus. I'm Wisner, and this is Ignex Dev Lab. Let's keep engineering a better future, one data point at a time. Join the lab by subscribing, and I'll see you in the next experiment.